Singapore's total population has fallen for the second consecutive year, mainly due to a decrease in work permit holders. According to the government's annual population in brief report, the total population was 5.45 million in June. That is a 4.1% reduction from last year, with the number of citizens, permanent residents and non-residents all showing declines. The figures for marriages and parenthood also fell in 2020 compared with 2019. There were 12.3% fewer marriages, in part due to measures introduced during the circuit breaker, as well as 2.8% fewer births among citizens. Here to discuss the data is Associate Professor Walter Theseira from the School of Business at the Singapore University of Social Sciences. Welcome to the show, Professor. Our population and birth rate numbers have been declining even before the pandemic. Professor, do you see this steeper drop as one-off owed to COVID-19? And do you think the figures will revert to their usual trajectory post-pandemic?
First, let's break down the drivers of our resident population growth. That's going to be immigration, births, and deaths. If you look at births and deaths, the long-term decline in our population growth rate, that's largely determined by our stagnant total fertility rate. Once you combine that with our aging population, that's actually the main reason why our population doesn't grow much over time. As for immigration, that's really the only policy lever that we have to control the overall population number. You know, we've been trying a lot over the years to boost total fertility rates, but in reality, our policies have had actually very little effect on moving the numbers there. So the big policy lever really is just your immigration rate. Now, when you look at this year's fall in the resident population, that's actually caused by COVID-19. Now, that's not because people are dying, fortunately. It is actually because more residents have been away from Singapore for at least 1 year. And that's because the population figure is based on whether somebody is ordinarily resident in Singapore, meaning present within the last 12 months. So for those Singaporeans who are working or living abroad, a lot of them weren't able to return at all during the last year, so they don't get counted. And of course, if somebody has a stable job overseas and you look at the economic fallout from COVID-19, they may also decide it's not a good time for them to return home either. So all of these things combined, that means that the rate of return of Singaporeans abroad in the last year has been very low. And that accounts basically for the population decline due to COVID-19.
Professor, it's the first time there's been a year-on-year decrease in both the citizen and resident populations since the data were first collected in 1970. Now, if this continues, what are the serious repercussions for Singapore?
Well, again, this year's decrease, it's likely caused by the fact that Singaporeans and PRs abroad just haven't been able to return to Singapore over the last year. Now, technically, if you're abroad permanently, if you're working or studying there, and you have reported that as such, you've changed your address officially to an overseas address, you are not counted in the local population. But I think a lot of people don't report that an overseas address, and so they drop out of our resident population at any point if they are not showing up in Singapore for at least 1 year. So I don't expect that this pattern of people not returning to Singapore will persist once travel starts reopening. What we would be concerned about is if our population starts to decline in the longer term because Singaporeans are moving permanently overseas to look for better opportunities. And that would affect the quality of our labor force, especially because we can expect that the ones who would leave Singapore to look for things elsewhere would be the most qualified, the most high-skilled Singaporeans. And, we've had worries about this kind of brain drain many decades ago. We haven't worried about it recently because Singapore today is such an attractive place to work. But we have to be mindful that we need to deliver a good economic recovery from COVID-19. Otherwise, highly qualified Singaporeans may well find better opportunities abroad, and that would actually harm the quality of our labor force.
Professor, thank you so much for your perspectives and for your time today. That was Associate Professor of Economics Walter Theseira from the Singapore University of Social Sciences.